All right, last time we did a little background building up to the war. The first point was steps towards war. And then we mentioned entangling alliances, colonialism, rivalry over land, nationalism, decline in morality. And there we went through a couple hundred years of philosophical history. And then we got to the immediate causes, or immediate cause of the war, an assassination, June the 28th, 1914. And again, that would have been a very minor event, but for this other framework of things in place. June the 28th, we have the assassination, and by August the 4th, we've got the major players in Europe involved in war. So, all right, the next thing I like to do, well, let me back up. We're going to cover this war a little bit differently. We're not going to go year by year through the war or something like that. I'll mention a few campaigns and that type of thing. But this war is really, as much as wars could be, really boring to study. It ends up being trench warfare, and there'll be these major battles where hundreds of thousands of people die, and the lines move a couple miles. And then the next major battle, they'll slide back to where they were. And so it's very little, there's not these great maneuvers to talk about, pretty boring in that sense. So we're not going to do a year-by-year rundown of whose turn it was to run across no man's land into fully automatic machine guns. We're not going to go blow by blow on that. So a little bit different approach to the war as we've done other wars. So, all right, first thing is participants in the war, the players on either side. And this is not all the players on either side, especially the Allied side. Got the right map. All right, so here you can see the trench lines. There's a little bit over here that takes place, so I'll make mention of, but relatively dull. If you think of the map for the Civil War and all the nice arrows and little stars, and that's not satisfying. So we'll approach it a little bit differently. All right, players, participants, the Central Powers, the bad guys, because they're on the opposite side from us. That's how you tell. The bad guys, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. The Turkish Empire down here, going back to the Ottoman Empire and the Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. You can see that big yellow hunk in the middle, and then Turkey, the Turkish Empire down there. Those pieces there are the Central Powers. You might see where the term central comes from. All right, the Allies, the other side of this, and this is the one where we'll just list some of the main players because there's lots and lots of them. Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. America, Greece, Belgium, Serbia, Japan, Portugal, Montenegro, etc. Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and us, and then others. There's all kinds of countries all over the place involved, even Japan, officially. So.
Who are the jumping on? Our side or their side?
Our side, the Allied side, yeah. Okay, two sides. Next thing I want to talk about is the uniqueness of this war. It was a very different war than prior wars. We talked about the trenches, that is one aspect of it, but some other things here about this war that make it unique. Two main points here. The first is the scope was beyond anything that had been seen before. The scope. All right, there's a term that's used to describe the scope of war here. It's called total warfare, and it involved everybody in the nation, especially if you happen to live in Europe. But even in America, everything was shifted towards war and production of war material, equipment for war, total warfare. So it's historically in the past, wars primarily involved the professional soldiers. They would fight someplace. There'd be lots of death and casualties, obviously, but the civilian population was not harmed as much. In this war, and really from this point on, the civilian population is involved much more and more, producing things, taking their chances of getting killed. Right? In a mechanized war like we're developing here, factories are legitimate military targets. They're producing the tools that the enemy's trying to kill you with. All right. So anyway, there's a whole new wave, a whole new change here, total warfare, and it involves the entire nation. And we see casualties skyrocketing, civilian casualties skyrocketing. Not unjustly so. I'm not trying to describe it as unfair, but very, very different war. All right, and then the second piece here with the scope of the war, that total warfare. And the second is the number of casualties was astronomical compared to anything up until this point. Between 8 and 10 million killed. And then another 20 million, give or take, people wounded. 8 to 10 million. Once you get that high, what's a million here or there? Really just astronomical casualties in this war. Okay, so the scope of this is beyond anything up until this point. Since this point, we've seen the same type of warfare other times, but at this point it was a new thing. All right, the other part here, the uniqueness of the war, is a whole bunch of new weapons and methods of warfare. Some of these are kind of fun. But new weapons. Really, you can think of the Industrial Revolution catching up to warfare. I mean, we talked about the engines and steam engines and trains and steel and all of that in the industrial world now being applied to war. We get this wave of things for war. So let me just give you a list here mostly of some new things that develop here. The first one is the machine gun, fully automatic machine gun. That'd be exciting. Anybody know anything about the history of the first guy to develop that?
Hiram Maxim.
Hiram Maxim, the Maxim machine gun, Jew. Always there's conspiracies there behind everything. Any Jews in here? I have to kill them at some point.
We had two brothers who also developed the silencer and smokeless powder.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Okay. Anything else about Hiram Maxim, the Maxim family?
I know he followed Edison over the electric light bulb.
Over who developed it first?
I think Edison developed it. So a week before, so they're both fighting on the patent.
Okay. Anybody know his motivation behind the machine gun? You might know, I don't know.
To make war.
He thought it would obsolete warfare. He thought, what idiots would continue to fight when you had this weapon? He was wrong. There were more idiots in the world than he thought. But fully automatic machine gun. If you're familiar with what guns, we go from a lever action type gun or a semi-automatic gun to you pull a trigger down and 700 or 800 rounds a minute are coming out. I mean, just some of the early pictures show the Maxim machine gun beside a tree that they just shot into. The tree has fallen over and they're leaning on the machine gun, bragging about what it could do. It just completely changed warfare. A lot of the casualties were because the officers didn't really adjust their tactics. They continued to do the same types of things as they did before the fully automatic machine gun. So now we have these charges. Instead of a bunch of guys shooting lever action rifles or something like that, it's these type of guns, and it just turns into a nasty bloodbath. So, all right, machine guns. Hiram Maxim. Next is blimps, Zeppelins, dirigibles, that whole wave of things, lighter than air vehicles, especially on the German side. All right, also tanks. They just, towards the end of the war, become effective. But what we think of as a tank comes along here. It was the answer to the machine gun. How do we get across all the trenches and all of the craters from bombs and things being dropped and have protection from the machine gun? The tank was the answer. When you get to travel in time and join into some battle, don't be a tank operator in these first tanks. All right? Imagine driving a gasoline-powered vehicle inside the engine compartment. There's no separation. You're inside the engine compartment driving this thing, and it's gas powered. Think of little sparks that might come from, you know, any projectiles that might be shot at you. Anyway, there was all kinds of stories of people driving these things for one day and then spending weeks and weeks recuperating before they can come back and do it again. It would not have been a fun place to be. So some of the tank drivers had to wear a special mask because if machine gun rounds or even some bigger caliber ones, they would ricochet around in the tank. So if you ever looked, they had like a special mask. Yeah. Anyway, don't go back and be a tank operator in World War I. Maybe World War II, but not World War I. Not the place to be. Sorry, tanks, new towards the end. There's also a fun story there behind the history of that. The Allied powers were developing this, and they were trying to keep the Germans from knowing what they were doing. So they had to explain why they're making these great, big, gigantic metal boxes. And the code was they were making water tanks to send to Russia to help with their supply problems. That was the cover story, and the term tank sticks. So, all right, poisonous gas, another new weapon. It was not a major player deciding the war on either side, but it definitely petrified lots of people. You know, if you have a choice, get shot by a machine gun 400 or 500 times and be dead, or breathe in this gas and have it melt your lungs away and you die of asphyxiation. Give me the machine gun, right? But really, it was petrifying. But it was not a major decider either way. It was also extremely dangerous, but that might be self-evident. But it was very crude. They would wait until the wind was blowing in the right direction, and then crank these cylinders open and let the wind blow it across the field into the enemy lines. You can imagine, you know, if the wind shifts, you're in trouble. So it's a little bit touchy. But poisonous gas, don't worry, we have banned poisonous gas by International War Convention, so we're safe. All right, long-range artillery is another one. Long-range artillery. Artillery that the largest ones were, sorry girls, anybody know the name of the largest one? I think it's appropriate. I don't know. Big Bertha, I mean, it's 75-mile range, right? Pretty good range. So long-range warfare. Trench warfare. As you know, we talked about the trenches before. It's probably something I'm glad I didn't hear.
We need her to garbage can Big Bertha.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right, Big Bertha. All right, trench warfare. A lot of the fighting took place in trenches on that western front of Europe. From the Alps to the coast there, all across there was trenches. Very nasty, ugly, gruesome way to fight. If you can imagine, don't imagine too much, but just enough to appreciate thousands and thousands of men living in a trench for weeks and weeks and weeks. Everything from food to sleeping to hygiene, facility, you know, just, anyway. Don't go back to World War I. Pick a different war to go to if you have to. So, all right, aerial warfare is another one. Planes. You know, the Snoopy on top of his doghouse fighting the Red Baron. All right, that's World War I, the classic age of the dogfights. So, and warfare, aerial warfare develops very, very quickly. It started out as just a reconnaissance mechanism. You'd fly over enemy lines, and then you start carrying hand grenades and pitching those out, and handguns and rifles, and then you start mounting machine guns, and then they start timing the fire of the machine gun to go through the, not through the propellers, between the propellers and things like that. So they make massive improvements. Some people didn't worry about the propellers. They just put a metal band on the propeller, so that if they happen to shoot the propeller, it just bounce off. So some of these old planes, you'll see a metal sleeve on the propeller at the point where the machine gun would fire through, and it just, that had to have been fun if you're flying a thing. You know, every now and then you're just going to have a round to come flying back at you. But anyway, massive improvements here very quickly through the war in air. So, and one last one is U-boats, German submarines. Imagine tanks underwater. You also don't want to be there. Okay, so there's a whole lot of new weapons. Here's the point. So the main point was uniqueness of the war, the scale of it, and then all these weapons here. It's very, very different than anything prior to this. All right, the next thing we talk about is America getting involved. All right, up until now, other than us being listed on the Allied side, we've not been involved at all. All right, let's run down through how we get involved. All right, the first point is financial interests. Or maybe before that, I have a little star there. We start out as neutral. All right, Wilson argued to be impartial in thought as well as action were his words. We start out as being neutral. But several things draw us into that, and the first is financial things. Excuse me. All right, the two thoughts here. First, the bulk of our trade went to the Allied countries. So even prior to the war, this was true, but especially as the war gets rolling, our trade interests are with the Allied powers. So we have that issue. And then the second issue with finances is a lot of the Allies end up getting loans from America. So that we had a financial interest here in the Allies winning. Trade as well as getting loans paid back. That doesn't really justify us getting in, but it leans us that direction at least. Okay, so financial interest, that's one. The second thing is the submarines. Submarines. And the submarines present a new problem. All right, we've talked about how this war was different, but they present a new problem. A couple problems. One is that it was typical and not unusual, if it was safe, for whoever was in a naval battle, the winning side, to pick up survivors, not just leave them floating around. Now, if there were still other enemy ships, they didn't risk getting themselves blown up. But they would pick up survivors and things like that, not just leave them to drown if it was possible to save them. Submarines present a significant challenge to that. Can anybody think of how it's a little bit different with a submarine? Anybody else? It'd be at the bottom of the ocean. There's a submarine. There's only so much space. So we have that factor involved. And when a submarine struck, it wasn't able to do any type of aid or help the people that survived the initial blast. So that's one problem. Another problem was they had to strike without ever really engaging the ship. They couldn't find out for sure what the ship was. They couldn't just pull out a bullhorn and send them a warning. They had to, through a periscope and reconnaissance, that type of thing, determine if it was a battleship and then attack it. They didn't have the luxury of approaching it and seeing how it responded and that type of thing. So these subs at this point were very fragile, even to just small arms fire. So they either had to strike pretty much unannounced or let the boat go. And they weren't, Germans are always evil since they're on the other side, but they weren't necessarily trying to shoot civilian ships. But they did at times shoot civilian ships. And the argument is whether it was intended or not, but it puts them in a quandary of shooting a ship because they think it's involved in the war, or not shooting a ship because they think it's not involved. And they didn't have the luxury, if they were a battleship, to just sail up to the thing and confront it. So the submarines present a new problem, and I can at least appreciate the quandary it put the Germans in here with these things. So, all right, several things happened beyond that. In February of 1915, Germany declares the entire area around the British Isles as a war zone. Basically just warning, anybody, if you're floating, you might get shot. American merchant ships, cruise ships, just, anybody. February of 1915, we get that. In May of that year, there's a famous cruise liner that was sunk, the Lusitania. There was about 1,200 people on the boat that died. 124 of them were Americans. All right, there were other incidences like that, but Lusitania, not unfairly, is the most famous.
For the Lusitania, when they found it, they were pretty sure that it was carrying war munitions, so it was a legitimate torpedo. So it was a legitimate torpedo. But they did find that it was carrying, I think, 1,200 people. So it was a legitimate torpedo. But they did find that it was carrying war munitions. So it was a legitimate torpedo.
That would, if it had that, it would be true. It's been a long time. I remember reading something about the even the way the deck was arranged. It was arranged for to have weapons on it and some things. So who knows? But that's way after the fact. At that point, it was a cruise ship, so very likely it was carrying something. So anyway, that boat gets sunk. Others along that line get sunk. Cruise ships, sometimes not cruise ships. So eventually, in August of that year, Germany pledges to stop this unrestricted warfare. So we're not going to just shoot anything we find. We're going to pull back from it for a time. They picked that back up in February of 1917. They really didn't. They didn't want to draw us into the war. And they knew that this would. So they stop it for a while and then pick it back up in 1917, February of 1917. By that point, they really figured it was just a matter of time until America got involved, and they might as well get ahead of the game. It was a calculated risk at that point. So the submarines definitely suck us in on the side of the Allied powers. All right, the next thing is the Zimmerman Note.
Before
Yes.
you go on, what do you say the Germans declared?
A battle, what do you call it? A war zone. The area around the British Isles, all the water around it is a war zone. They were going to try to shoot anything. So, and they back off of that in August of 1915 and then go back to it in February of 1917. If it's on the waters, it's fair game. So, all right, so that was the U-boats, submarines. Next is the Zimmerman Note. There are 3 M's and 2 N's in there if you're trying to spell it. Zimmermann, Zimmerman Note. All right, this is also early 1917. This guy, Alfred Zimmermann, was the German Foreign Secretary. Think of like Secretary of State for us. He was in that position. And he sent a message to Mexico. Anybody remember anything in Mexico recently? Not today, recently at this point? What's happened in Mexico?
A bunch of revolutions and then Contra.
Yeah, a little bit of bad blood between us and Mexico. All right, so he sends a message to Mexico promising that if Mexico attacked America, Germany would help. You guys attack America, we'll help you out in the fight. And when word of this got out, all right, there was some justifiable rage. There's already, like we said, problems with Mexico and Pancho Villa and all that, and now we have Germany going to the same Mexican government and promising to give them aid and support if they would attack us. So, now again, by this point in 1917, Germany is assuming at some point we're going to get involved. And they're trying to complicate the issue, either destroy enough of our boats so that we're hindered there, or distract us by getting Mexico to attack us. So they are here thinking it's just a matter of time, and this was some way to try to delay the thing. But anyway, the Zimmerman Note, obviously, once this is made public, lots and lots of people are very infuriated and ready to go to war right at that point. So, all right, there's one more thing we've got to get here in this build-up, and it seems unrelated, except for philosophically. In March of 1917, Russia has a revolution. Not the famous one in October, where they become communist. This one, they just throw off the Tsar and establish a democracy. It fails completely, but they have a revolution in March of 1917. So, and you might think completely no relation other than philosophically. Looked like.
Wouldn't that cause Germany to not have to fight on that front anymore, so they could have all their troops on?
Well, no, the new government tried to stay in the war, and it was very unpopular. It's part of what paved the way for the October Revolution. So, oh, I thought you were going to say something.
Russia was on the Allied side, and it was the spread of democracy.
Okay. Before this point, we had all of these Allied powers and this monarchy, and the Allied powers, other ones are some form of democracy. And we were, especially Wilson, very reluctant to get in on the side with the czarist regime. Now all of a sudden the czar's gone. It's a democracy. So we have all democracies against the Germans and these other monarchist type regimes. So philosophically, it cleaned up the mess. It's all democracies. And we do get Wilson talking about making the world safe for democracies and things of that nature. So this revolution, even though it wasn't directly connected, does philosophically then remove that barrier of us joining in and helping a czarist monarchy, basically.
Was this the Bolshevik Revolution or the
No.
Revolution in October?
That was October. Yeah, this is a separate one. Yeah, it was a busy year for the Russians. So. Okay, so we have the revolution there. Now, later that year they become communists, but it's in the interim there that we join the war when it's all democracies against the dictators and things on the other side. So, all right, so the Russian Revolution in March of 1917. All right, eventually then it was April the 6th of 1917 that we declare war on Germany. All right, questions there? I once read the Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. I think it was in that book, and they said that this is a very jaded view of this, but they made the point that America went to war here for the right of neutral ships to carry war munitions in a war zone. All right, now, you know, a little bit jaded view, but anyway. If you read some, you know, I've read other places, we weren't justified. I don't think that was especially the case. So, all right, I have all that as America's involvement. There's one last thing to talk about underneath America being involved, and then we'll drop back and talk about the war itself. I want to talk about America getting ready for the war. We had to ramp up all kinds of things to get troops on the ground. It was April 1917 that we declare war, and we do several things. All right, first is finances. We had to pay for this somehow. It was kind of a novel thing. You know, imagine, you know, trying to plan to figure out how to pay for something. Wish we would do that today. So, we raised money two ways. About a third was raised through taxes, increasing that progressive income tax that we saw made constitutional. The taxes increased, and the other was through war bonds. About 2/3 of the money was raised through war bonds. People giving extra money, buying these war bonds. Phrases like, it's cheaper to win than to lose, or give until it hurts. And there were community challenges to see which cities could give the most money, but private citizens essentially loaning money to the government. That's an easy way to think of a war bond. All right, so we raised money that way to pay for this stuff. The second thing is a little bit about industry and labor. Once in our preparations here for this, Wilson was given very broad power to regulate all kinds of parts of the business world. All kinds of things. They would regulate which factories were making what, how much we're going to get paid, how things were transported across the country. We have the government here taking direct control over major sections of the economy here to streamline the war munitions production. Anybody think the government's good at streamlining anything? No, it's not. And a lot of these regulations, the government is very reluctant to completely let go of these things after the war. But we do have Wilson taking over a lot of those, direct control over lots of things here to, the excuse was to streamline the production for the war. The free market would have filled in the gaps just fine. All right, still with industry and labor, we have the American workers threw themselves into this thing. The workers in these factories, you know, they weren't so much worried about the government dictating what they were making, but they looked at their job as being critical to the war effort. Them making bombs, them making guns, ammunition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, a significant contribution to the war. So the workers of America threw themselves into this thing. And then the last thing here was the American people as a whole threw themselves into it. People did all they could to conserve things. They would go without meat on certain days, or not use electricity on certain days, or not use their heat on certain days, and grow gardens so they would not have to buy produce and stuff that could have been turned towards the war. So the American people did lots and lots to conserve everything as much as possible to provide for the war. So we get daylight savings time out of this, supposedly having us be awake and operating when it was daylight more, so we wouldn't have to use lights as much. No, never really, anyway. There's been lots of studies that it doesn't really affect anything, but we're still stuck with it. All right, last thing here with us preparing for the war is raising an army. We had a relatively small army before, and we ended up with over 4 million people. We started out with about 200,000, ended up with over 400, well, almost at 400 million, over 4 million soldiers eventually involved in the war. So we have this massive influx, some getting drafted, some volunteering, just wave after wave of people into the war. The draft initially was set up for people between 21 and 30. So is anybody here even eligible for the draft under those conditions? I go out the top end. Anybody 21? Who's pointing at you? I don't know. Are you 21?
25.
All right, so you could get drafted. Anybody want to volunteer? Okay. So eventually it gets dropped from 18 to 45, which I haven't bumped off the top end of that one if you're wondering. So that would be most of us could get drafted. If you've ever watched It's a Wonderful Life, there's a little short scene of Harry Potter sitting at a board. It was the draft board, and he was running the draft board for their town. So, all right, so anyway, we raise an army, hundreds of thousands of people being brought into the army, either volunteering or getting drafted into the army. So, all right, a little bit about us getting prepared. Now let's talk about the war. And we are doing good. We can finish this up. All right, let me give you some of the major battles. And again, this is, we're not going to be able to follow all kinds of movements and that type of thing. There are things that take place outside of Europe, but the main fighting is there in Europe. All right, the first thing is the Battle of the Marne, M-A-R-N-E. This is the opening wave of fighting. If you can think back, which may be a long time for you, we talked about the assassination and all the countries getting sucked in here, and then Germany getting involved and them attacking through Belgium into France, and England getting involved there. The initial battle I'm talking about is the battle here, the Germans invading through Belgium and that whole initial conflict. That thing, well, it's September of 1914. That thing ends with the next main battle, and it would be hard to really pinpoint the boundary, but it kind of bleeds into the next one. It's referred to as the race to the sea. That essentially is the creation of the trench lines. We have the two armies meeting, and the progress stagnating. They begin to build trenches right there. So they would take turns. One army would try to outflank the other, and then this army would respond and extend their trench lines, and then go the other direction. And these trenches just stretch all the way across, literally from the mountains, you can see down to Switzerland, to the coast. All right, and that's the race to the sea, the sea being, once you hit the water, you couldn't keep digging trenches. You had to stop. Right, so that was the second kind of phase of the war. All right, 1915 essentially was occupied with that type of operation. Okay, another battle is the Battle of Verdun, V-E-R-D-U-N, February of 1916. Might be tough to see really well here, but Verdun is right here. And you can see some lines that kind of wrap around Verdun, and Verdun staying on the Allied side the entire time. Verdun was the Germans, they were trying to take Verdun. They picked a spot that they knew the French would defend tooth and nail, which is, it's hard to find for the French. They picked a spot that they would defend tooth and nail and just keep hammering away. And we get hundreds of thousands of casualties here. It never gets taken, the French managed to hold on to, but just hundreds of thousands of casualties here. The Germans intentionally picking a spot where they knew the French wouldn't give up, but they could just keep hammering and hammering and hammering. So Verdun. Another one, the Battle of Jutland. It's the one that's in the blue up there. It's on the oceans. All right, this is the only major naval battle. We have submarine issues, but as far as a traditional naval battle is Battle of Jutland. The German fleet gets beat by the British fleet. The German fleet goes into the harbor, and they stay there. So that's the end of the surface fighting especially. We have the U-boats throughout the whole war. All right, another one, the Battle of, just lost it, Belleau Woods, B-E-L-L-E-A-U, and Caleb, please don't correct my pronunciation. B-E-L-L-E-A-U, Woods. I mentioned that one because that's the first one where Americans were involved significantly. It was June of 1918. By that point, we had enough troops that had gotten into the army, been trained, made it across, made it to the front lines, that we have significant number of our soldiers fighting in that one. All right, let me give you one more, the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Might as well use the board since we have it. The Meuse-Argonne campaign. This is the final drive that ends with Germany's surrender. This is the last campaign, September of 1918. There's a famous incident that takes place during the Meuse-Argonne campaign. There's lots of famous incidences all over this, but there's a movie made out of this one about a pacifist who thought it was wrong to go to war, but has literally a mountaintop conversion according to the movie. Two people, anybody? Alvin York, yeah, when he fights in this campaign, based on a true story. He personally himself killed 20 plus men and captured 132 people. Kind of impressive for one guy.
And I think 20 of them were officers or something.
I mean, it would have been officers. He had them carry their own machine guns into captivity, 35 machine guns. Anyway, an amazing feat. Marshal Foch said this was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of the armies of Europe. This one is anyway. So Alvin York here towards the end of the war. I have no idea who counted this, but this is an interesting little tidbit. It's calculated that there was more ammunition fired during this last campaign than fired by the Northern Army in the Civil War for the entire war. We talked about the machine gun and the volume of fire being produced here, and so. All right, so some of the major battles. Like I said, all of those for the most part are pushes on the trenches where they move a couple miles here or there. Very, very little movement. So, all right. Next is some of the commanders of the war. So you know some names of people involved. One already mentioned. He praised Alvin York, Marshal Foch, F-O-C-H. He was the commander of all the Allied forces.
Say that again.
Marshal Foch, F-O-C-H. Oh, commander of all the Allied forces. The German commander was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Kaiser of Germany, I guess. Anybody know the guy in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, the commander actually of our forces, who had been under Foch, but the commander of our forces? Two people know, but he chased after Pancho Villa. He's named after a card game, his nickname. That doesn't help any. Nothing. Should we let Matthew go? Go ahead.
Blackjack Pershing.
Yes, Blackjack Pershing. General John Pershing was his name. Blackjack Pershing. I actually don't know if he's named after a card game or if that comes from something else, but.
He led the Black Buffalo troops in the Spanish American.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so Pershing was the commander of our forces. All right, last thing. We've got to talk about the end of the war. All right, Armistice Day. Don't get too excited. There's a little bit of material we need to talk about, but the end of the war. First thing we're going to talk about is a speech that Wilson gave on January the 8th of 1918. We're approaching the end of the war. America really, at this point, is still a newcomer, but oh well. January 8th, 1918, Wilson gave a speech talking about victory and what was going to happen and all kinds of stuff. And as part of this speech, he laid out 14 points. These are called his 14 points, Wilson's 14 points, about what should happen after the Allies win. They dealt with boundaries in Europe of countries and how they should be redone, just disputed territory. 14 points. The first 13 really deal with things of that era, not any real long-ranging implications especially. But the 14th point, unfortunately, has had some long-range implications. The last point of his speech was he wanted to set up a League of Nations. Right? Think of a weak United Nations. Now, the United Nations is weak and insignificant, really, except for us. Think of one that's weaker than that. Right? A League of Nations. That was his last point. This is his words here. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Sounds good. Can we tell me in a real world how people maintain their territorial integrity? Yes, if somebody tries to take your territory, you kill them. This United Nations, League of Nations is a crazy idea. But anyway, it was his brainchild. It was his thing. He pushed it, gave the speech on it. These 14 points get dropped over enemy lines so that they know these great things that we're going to do for them when we win. Gets pushed heavily. So, all right, so we have Wilson's speech that was January of 1918. He gives that, laying out this framework, at least, for what was going to happen, and for us especially, that League of Nations. All right. The next point is, started in the fall of 1918, we begin to see the Central Powers collapsing.
What power?
Central Powers. The first is Bulgaria. They fall in September. Turkey, the Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire, October. Austria-Hungary was November the 3rd. And then we're down to just Germany. And they surrender on the 9th. The Kaiser flees, there's a mutiny, but anyway, November the 9th, Germany surrenders. November the 3rd. Okay, so we get, starting in September, the Central Powers beginning to surrender. November the 9th was the last one. The actual armistice was signed on November the 11th, 1918, the agreement between us, the Allied powers, and Germany to end the fighting. They met at 11 o'clock that morning, so we have the 11th month, the 11th day, and the 11th hour that they met to sign this thing. And there were some incredibly insane things that happened that morning.
I read a book on just the last month of the war, and they had people, I think it's 5,000 people dying November 11th, up until they had people attacking across the User River, right up until
Yeah, just imagine this. Everybody knows at 11 they're signing the armistice. I mean, Germany's already given up. The Germans are sitting in their lines waiting for the end, and they look across the trenches and they see the Allies beginning, preparing to run across no man's land. So they start shooting them. I don't remember the numbers, but she says 5,000. It was significant numbers of people that died that morning. All right? And at the heart of it was some of the military commanders in countries wanted to take back some land that had been taken by military force. They didn't want to get it back in a treaty. They wanted to take it back by force. They felt it was some sort of disgrace to get it in a treaty.
So one British general said,
Right,
that's why he wanted to.
I've often think about the soldiers. You know, you're sitting there in the trenches at 11 o'clock. We're done. You know, and you get the command. You know, let's go over the top. All right. Anyway, stupidity happening that morning. But anyway, 11 o'clock, they signed the treaty. All right, not the treaty, the armistice. This is just the agreement to quit fighting. There's a treaty that comes along a little bit later. This armistice does a couple of things. Let me just quickly list you the types of things that it does. Germany had to evacuate all the territory that they'd occupied. Germany was itself occupied by the Allied forces. So Germany had to return all of their prisoners that they'd captured. So the usual types of things here when one side surrenders had to happen. All right, so that was the armistice that was signed. All that was an agreement to quit fighting. All right. Then the representatives from either side get together and start negotiating a treaty. And the treaty that comes out of this is the Treaty of Versailles, V-E-R, Versailles. Treaty of Versailles. All right, Wilson went personally over to head this. Remember, he's throwing out this idea of this League of Nations, and he's wanting to drive that. So he goes personally to help negotiate this thing. And we eventually get a treaty out of this thing with 5 provisions. Come on, what have we learned from other treaties? Any good treaty has 3 provisions, and we have 5. So we know right off the bat. At least it's still an odd number, and it's a prime, but it's the wrong odd prime. So. All right, the 5 provisions of the treaty. Come on. You're laughing like this man is insane. You're laughing at Joseph, he's laughing. So. All right, here's the provisions. First of all, Germany had to accept the blame for the war guilt. Now that might hopefully strike you as a little bit odd. Germany, remember the countries involved at the beginning? Okay. Now, we can't completely wipe Germany of any blame. They did, once the fighting started, just go ahead and plow through Belgium into France. But they had to accept the guilt for the whole thing. In practical terms, other than pointing your finger at them and saying, you bad guys, they had to pay reparations. $33 billion in reparations was what they were expected to pay back to the Allied powers for the war. All right. Second thing is they had to disarm. Their army was restricted to 100,000 men. America's army at the start was 200,000. Right? They're restricted to just 100,000. Minuscule. Third thing is they lost territory. Colonies all over the world. Pieces of land in Europe were taken from them. Pieces given to France. Lost territory. The fourth part is Eastern Europe was divided up into a bunch of different countries. That's why some of Wilson's other points talked about the realigning the boundaries of countries and different ethnic groups and countries and that type of thing. So we get a wave of that type of stuff. And then the fifth point is this League of Nations. League of Nations. All right, so we get that treaty out of the war. In America's constitutional system, what has to happen before a treaty becomes valid? The president does not have the authority to just, on his own, obligate us to a treaty. I'll let other people answer. It's got to go through the Senate, just the Senate. The Senate has to approve this thing. So this treaty never makes it through the Senate. It never gets approved. All right. Let me give you a little bit of what's going on in the Senate, and then we'll talk about, we do eventually stop being at war, but we don't accept the treaty. In the Senate, there were 3 groups of people. There was a group of people that were dead set against the League of Nations. Under no circumstances are we going to approve the League of Nations. They were called the irreconcilables. And they're the sane group in the Senate. The second group were mixed on it. didn't especially like it, but they were willing to at least entertain the idea. And then there's a group of loyalists who were for it. They were loyal to Wilson. They liked the League of Nations. And in the end, they couldn't get enough votes to pass the treaty. All right, so what eventually happens is Congress just passes the resolution in 1921, ending the war. Significant. Wait a minute, we didn't have troops on the ground, but this is an ongoing thing for several years, and it's 21 finally that we get Congress ending the war.
What was the second point?
The reservationists, or reservationists, the people with reservations, mixed emotions on it. All right, so Treaty of Versailles. We never ratify it. We never become part of the League of Nations. A little bit of a slap in the face to Wilson. This was his baby. I think a just slap in the face. We shouldn't have been part of it. Okay, World War I. Questions there?